thank you for tuning in to our first episode on the Warsaw Uprising. Just to give you all a little bit more info on what you're going to be listening to. I am Alina Nowobilska, and with me for the next 65 days is Clare, Mulley and Roger Moorhouse. This podcast will have a new episode each day where we'll talk about the events of the day, people who took part in the uprising, daily life, and what the Germans and Soviets were doing. Each episode will have a testimony or two, and if you check out our social media, so our Twitter account, TikTok, and Instagram, you'll be able to find more testimonies that we posted daily. Honestly, thank you so much to everyone who's helped us on this project, including Steve Smith, who's done our graphics, Chris Sams, who's helped us with our research and back office stuff, and Zane Whitney, who did our intro and outro music. Philip Steinchuk, who you haven't heard yet, but you will do tomorrow, he's the one who does our daily intros, and not forgetting everyone who's contributed their voice. Now on to what this episode is all about. We thought that some of our listeners who don't know much about Poland during the Second World War deserve to have a little bit of background knowledge, so this episode is dedicated to understanding why the uprising began and why the Poles had to fight for their freedom. So to kick all of this off, Claire, tell us a little bit about what the uprising is all about.
The Warsaw Uprising was the largest organised act of defiance against Nazi Germany during the Second World War. It was the Home Army, which is the Polish army, the Polish resistance army. So Poland already has the majority of their armed forces left Poland in 1939, went overseas, regrouped in France, moved to Britain, Scotland, and took part in many different very important battles across Europe. But there is a resistance army as well called the Home Army, which is under the command of Komorowski at this point in the war, although the commander of the uprising itself is Monta. And the idea was that Warsaw, we're now in the summer of 1944. So already in June, we've had D-Day. The Allied forces from the West have started the liberation of continental Europe. And from the East, the forces of the Soviet Union, the Red Army, are officially allies as well at this point in the war since 1941, since June 41, and they are moving to Europe as well. They're kind of almost racing towards Berlin, but at this point they're going quite slowly into Polish territory. And the concept of the Poles is that they want to liberate their own capital before the Soviets march in to take credit for Warsaw's liberation. They want to welcome the Red Army as free citizens rather than to be indebted to the Soviet forces coming in. So already in July, Soviet Moscow radio has been broadcasting saying, rise up. If you don't rise up, then you are accepting the situation. You're not fighting. It's essentially collaboration. And so there's immense pressure on them to rise up. But Komorowski has rightly been waiting until he feels that the Home Army, with the support of the Ally, hopefully through airdrops, he thinks that they can probably secure the liberation of Warsaw within a couple of days, but they are prepared to hold out for up to 2 weeks. And they've been making preparations such as weapons, storage, supplies of foods and medicines and so on to support this uprising. So they're prepared to hold out for 2 weeks, but they're hoping it's going to be over much sooner than that. But what happens in the event is the Red Army basically encamps as they get close to Warsaw on the far side of the Vistula, the big river that Warsaw sits on. They encamp and they just wait. They wait for the battle between the Nazi German occupying forces and the Polish resistance, essentially so that then they feel that they'll be better able to take control of the political situation in Poland after the war. So they are waiting encamped, and so the Polish forces have to continue the fight. And that is the Warsaw Uprising.
I mean, that was a wonderful, wonderful summary, Claire. Thank you. I mean, what you alluded to, and there's a lovely formula that I always give when I think about this, is that although militarily the rising is aimed against the Germans, politically it's aimed against the Soviets, which is what you were describing, right?
Yes.
And then to a large extent, the rising in Warsaw, which begins on the 1st of August 44, is part of a much wider organisation, this Operation Storm of Warsaw, which was right across occupied Poland. And the intention, of course, was, I mean, a lot of that stalled, or it was kind of, strangled in the crib, as it were, by the arrival of the Soviets. But it has its greatest expression in Warsaw, but it is part of a wider operation. And the overarching intention, of course, is to sort of fill the gap as the Germans retreat, is that they can fill the gap ideally with minimal fighting, right? So as you absolutely rightly put it, to then be able to welcome the Soviets as free citizens, having effectively liberated their own territory.
We need to go back perhaps a little bit in history to explain why there is this antagonism between the Soviet Union and Poland, because, obviously, let's go right back to the start of the Second World War. So on the 1st of September, Nazi German forces invade across the Polish border, plunging the whole world into war. And for 17 days, it's the battle. And in fact, the Poles do well. They resist very well. But on the 17th of September, Soviet forces invade from the east. And at that point, Poland is fighting two hostile powers. Now, the Soviets, claim that they're coming over because there is no longer an effective government in Poland, and that they need to protect ethnic Soviet people in eastern Poland. It sounds all very familiar, doesn't it? But in fact, there is a secret protocol, a secret agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And they have long agreed that they will come in as twin aggressors. And Poland can't maintain the fight on two fronts. And so they pull the large part of their armed forces out through Romania into France to regroup, and then across to Britain. And it's only in June 1941, when Hitler betrays his erstwhile ally Stalin with Operation Barbarossa and invades Soviet-held territory in Europe, that the Soviet Union, Stalin is absolutely flabbergasted. He's shocked, and it takes him about 2 weeks to process what's happened. He can't believe that Hitler would be this foolish, this mad, really, and rightly so. But 2 weeks later, Churchill is immediately extending, saying, come on, join the Allies. And Stalin does a volte-face and becomes the Allies. So, if you look at Soviet history, of course, for them, it's the Great Patriotic War, and it starts in 1941. They don't talk about anything from 1939. So Poland then is in this very difficult position where they have they're officially allies now, obviously with the West, but also with the Soviet Union after Stalin's volte-face. And so this is a country that had invaded, annexed their territory, and now they have to fight alongside them. So roll forward to the summer of 1944, and they know that the Germans are beginning to pull back. The Allies have invaded continental Europe. The Germans are, beginning their retreat. They've been forced back quite a long way in the East already by the Soviets as well. So this is the prime moment for Poland to be able to rise up and liberate its own capital city, part of its own territory. And as you say, it's part of a big, across the entire country of Poland. But as the Soviets come in, it's this, initially the resistance forces, the partisans welcome them and they serve together, but then they're arrested and they start disappearing into Soviet territory. So it's very unclear how friendly these allies are, which puts the absolute pressure on the Poles to say, yes, you are not liberating us. We have reconquered this territory. We have liberated our own territory, and we have set up our own political authorities here. We don't need the Soviets to come in and establish anything. Thank you. That is the plan.
The crucial element in Warsaw is that, as I said, the Polish plan is to sort of fill the vacuum, as it were, between the retreating Germans and the advancing Soviets. But in the case of Warsaw, that initially works. They sort of time it just about right. But then there's a German decision taken, and again, this goes right to the top, a German decision to essentially turn and fight and use what they saw it from a German perspective, what they saw as an opportunity to, as they would have put it, lance the Polish boil, to destroy Warsaw, to destroy the resistance. As Himmler put it in a conversation with Hitler, he said, this is our chance to remove that obstacle to the east that has been in our way for 700 years. So they turn and fight, and rather than continuing that retreat, they turn and fight and opt instead to take on those insurgent Polish forces in the capital, and also very consciously to destroy the capital and its population.
And actually, it's really interesting. Perhaps we can look at this later on in the podcast. But if you compare it to the situation in Paris, we have the liberation of Paris that happens during this. And there, the forces from the West are coming in, and the Germans turn and disappear. This one is completely different. The forces from the West aren't near enough. The forces that are coming towards them that are very close are the Soviet forces, the Red Army coming from the east. But they don't progress. They stop, stand still and wait, while the Germans turned back to finish the job. So almost diametrically opposed. Fascinating.
Yes, it is. And of course, the attitude of the liberation is very different. So in the West, in the Parisian case, you can see it is genuinely a liberation. Whereas in the case of the Soviets, it was dressed up as a liberation, but it really wasn't. And the Poles knew very well that it wasn't, because they'd experienced the same thing. You know, when the Russians arrive, Russians, Soviets, you know, let's merge those together for one moment. I always object to that, but let's do it. When the Russians arrive, the Poles know very well that they never leave.
Yeah.
They didn't leave in 1830. They didn't leave in 1863, and they weren't going to leave if they came in. They didn't leave in 1939 until they were pushed out. So they knew very well that they weren't going to leave, that this wasn't a liberation, however much it was professed to be so. So hence the necessity for this precarious sort of balancing act of trying to fill that vacuum, to present yourself to the incoming Red Army as a legitimate, you know, would-be government, as your own liberators, to forestall or to try and, I suppose, if possible, prevent that sort of instant Sovietization, which they thought was coming.
Yeah, and they were right. And also, right. I mean, I took it back to 1939, but of course you could take it back, you're right, to bring in that previous history as well, because, you know, this is a country that only got its independence back again as a Polish nation after the First World War, after 120 plus years of annexation, occupation, division of territory between the hostile empires around it, including the Russian powers and the German powers, the Prussians. So all of that history makes it...
All that feeds into the mindset in 44, yeah.
They've only had 20 years of independent Poland. You know, this is a generation that has grown up as children. They experienced the euphoria of that liberation. And they, you know, they're not going to let it go, A, on their watch. They don't want to let Poland be annexed and occupied and controlled again. And B, also against the Germans, let's not forget the appalling atrocities that took place on Polish territory, which gives them this, you know, they are desperate to fight against that hated foe. So the emotional stakes are very high as well.
I think probably one of the best examples we can find of this idea of liberation, and yes, I'm using quotation marks when it refers to the Soviets, is probably looking at Vilna, or modern-day Vilnius. The Soviets liberated, and I'm using this in loose terms, for about 2 weeks, everything's calm, it's orderly. And then after 2 weeks, the Soviets start rounding everybody up. The Home Army members arresting them and putting them in a prison that only literally weeks before was being used as a Gestapo prison. So the idea here is that you're switching one occupier for another. And the Warsavians who'd begun to hear this were trying to stop all of this from happening. The same thing happened in Lvov, or modern-day Lviv. This would be the future for Warsaw if they didn't liberate the city and have it under Polish control. The Soviets could not, and I can't underline this enough, the Soviets could not be trusted. And over the uprising, more and more reports of Soviet betrayal would be arriving in Warsaw. It was a city filled with young people who had suffered oppression for 5 years. It was time for retribution. There's one more thing I want to add before I finish. It's an incredible quotation found by my friend Zane Whitney on one of the British censorship reports from a Polish officer who was based in Italy. And I just want to remind people, this is a quote, but it was translated from Polish to English, so the English is a little bit broken, but I want to read it word for word. Quote, "Our Warsaw is bloodying again. In 1939, Warsaw, by its fighting to the end, won admiration of the whole world. Today she fights again to let the world know that she is the capital of free Poland. We are fighting for our freedom since 1939, and we will never surrender, no matter who is with or against us. Today we are alone, but we'll go on fighting to the end as our Warsaw."
So the scene is set for this mass act of defiance against Nazi Germany in force, but also against the Soviet Union.